So we're going to skip some of the details and deliberation, but basically what we ended up with was two major proposals. The first was the one favored by the big states, known as the Virginia Plan. This was favored by Madison and his nationalist colleagues, and came as a surprise to those who were still holding out hope to revise the Articles of Confederation. This plan was going to have a bicameral legislature, or one with two houses. Members of the lower chamber would be apportioned among the states by population and directly elected. So, in this plan, bigger states would have more representation in the lower chamber. Then, members of this lower chamber would elect members of the upper chamber from lists generated by state legislatures. The legislative branch would also have veto power over the states, giving the federal government supremacy over state governance. This plan also gave the federal government the right to use military power against the states if they chose not to fulfill their obligations. As you can imagine, opposition quickly formed to this plan, fearing both that it gave the federal government too much power and that it interfered with the sovereignty of the smaller states, who would be overruled by the larger states under this plan, where larger states get more representation in the lower chamber of commerce. The opposition had to come up with a counter-response, and that was known as the New Jersey Plan. It was initially proposed by William Paterson of New Jersey, and it was drafted so quickly that it failed to address the executive branch or the judiciary. They were simply fighting against this Congress that seemed to be out of control. This plan kept much of the structure of the Articles of Confederation, but with a few major changes. They gave Congress the power to tax and allowed a simple majority to enact national policy rather than a supermajority. These additions made it much simpler to get things done, making the federal government much stronger just in those little tweaks alone. We couldn't resolve the difference between these two plans in the full committee, so the stalemate lasted for a few weeks. Ultimately, they sent it to a smaller subcommittee of revisions to try and get things squared away and get a final compromise plan done that everybody could agree with. The plan they created was known as the Great Compromise. As in any compromise, each side gets a little bit of what they want. The upper chamber, the Senate, would be composed of 2 delegates sent from each state legislature who would serve a 6-year term. Madison's population-based elective legislature became what's known now as the House of Representatives. They also adopted the New Jersey Plan's idea that only a majority would be required to pass legislation, making national action much, much easier. Finally, they inserted what would later be known as the Elastic Clause, or the Necessary and Proper Clause. The idea behind Article 1, Section 8 is that Congress can do what is necessary and proper to regulate interstate commerce. As we'll see going forward, this turns into basically everything because everything is interstate commerce. It can be stretched out to encompass virtually anything the federal government wants it to encompass. That's why it's called the Elastic Clause. This clause right here, these short sentences, gave the national government tremendous power going forward and have been the reason we've seen such expansion of federal powers throughout the 230 years since this document was written. So, once we've got the legislature figured out, it's time to move on to the executive branch. The delegates looked to different state governors, and there was tremendous variation in the rules that states used to pick their leaders. Some had leaders elected for life, while some gave the governor a year non-renewable term. A wide range here, right? We have some people just for a year where you can't come back. Others are, you are the governor for the rest of your life. We have to figure out what the happy medium in there is, because one seems like not quite enough, the other seems like potentially way too much power. So, for the president, we created a compromise of 4-year terms with the possibility of re-election for as long as possible. However, George Washington, our first president, as history majors may know, created the norm of only running for 2 terms, which lasted all the way through FDR in the 1930s and 40s. The next challenge was to make the president independent, yet limiting his power. So, the first thing they did was limited the scope of his authority. Second, he couldn't propose legislation, but they gave the president the ability to veto legislation passed by Congress. Additionally, they even put a check on that small power by requiring a supermajority of each house to override a presidential veto. Finally, they created the Electoral College as a way of keeping the president accountable to the states, giving different states the prerogative of selecting the president rather than giving the people direct control.